Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I guess I'm going to start with a reading, unless, Michaela, you wanted to say something first.
I would love a reading first, if you would like, and then yeah, I can ask you some questions.
Great. So I'm going to be reading one of from the first chapter of my book, Hijab Butch Blues. The first chapter is called Maryam, and it's named after the Virgin Mary, also known as Maryam in the Quran. And it's one of my personal favorite sections in this book. It's about it's section number 5, if anyone has a book. And in this section, I talk about being 14 and in high school and living in a country in the Middle East, going to an international school with kids from kind of all over the world, and living in a way that feels really hard. Like I constantly feel like wanting to disappear. And in the section, we've just read the story of Maryam, specifically the story about her giving birth to Isa, also known as Jesus. And there's this moment in the story where she's raging to God about wanting to die, and just the sort of like the both the agency and the anger in that sort of like screaming to God has really inspired me, and I'm excited to know more about the story. The week after reading about Maryam wanting to die, I look forward to the next Quran class. I'm jittery as the time approaches and eager to start walking to the language lab. As usual, my class of 22 girls whittles down to a little more than half as we wind our way through the school building to the annex on the other side of campus. The other girls are unhurried when they get there. They take their time choosing seats and chattering and settling, but I'm fast. Notebook out, pen out, headphones on, ready to start the lesson. I'm jumpy, hyper aware of everyone and everything, anxious that I'm being transparent, that everyone can tell that I'm craving the next installment of the story of Maryam, that I'm leaning in so as not to miss a word, that I'm grasping at everything I can learn about this woman who complains to God and wants to die. But today is a review lesson, the Quran teacher tells us, to prep for our midterm the week after. I'm devastated. I'll have to wait an entire week to know what happens next while we recap the 30 or so verses we've already read and then review the recitation, the hard words, and the English translation for our upcoming test. Someone in the front row starts reading the beginning of the surah aloud, and I sigh, slip into my usual half listening mode. I nudge my best friend sitting next to me and ask to borrow her multicolored pens for doodling. Then someone reads the translation of these verses aloud. And mention in the book the story of Maryam when she withdrew from her family to a place toward the east, and she took in seclusion from them a screen. Then we sent to her our angel, and he represented himself to her as a well-proportioned man. She said, Indeed, I seek refuge in the most merciful from you, so leave me if you should be fearing of Allah. He said, I am only the messenger of your Lord to give you news of a pure boy, Isa. She said, How can I have a boy while no man has touched me? I stop doodling, stop calculating how many minutes till the end of class, stop thinking about the bag of chips in my backpack, stop breathing for a second, my body caught in a moment of clarity that shoots through me and suspends my thoughts. Suddenly, my arm raises of its own accord, and before I'm aware of making any conscious decision, I'm speaking, my voice higher than usual and breathless. Miss, Miss, did Miriam say that no man has touched her because she didn't like men? There is a pause, 2 seconds of shocked silence before my classmates break into titters. Some roll their eyes. This sounds a lot like one of my infamous questions that derailed the class, and some of my classmates are annoyed that I've interrupted their get out of jail free summary of the classes they've skipped and the things they need to know for the midterm. But I'm grateful, so grateful for the tittering. It conceals my earnestness. I'm grateful for my earlier antics that I get to play off this question as a moment of clowning instead of a sincere, burning desire for an answer. I need to know, is this a thing? Are there other women like me who don't like men? Who would tell a handsome, well proportioned man angel who appeared before them to go away? Who have never been touched by men? Who don't want to be touched by men? The Quran teacher, a matronly Sudanese woman in her 60s who has always been kind to me, doesn't seem to read anything into my question and mercifully does not skip a beat in her answer. No, she says, it's because Maryam had taqwa. She had God consciousness in its highest state of being. It's because Maryam was pious and loved and feared God. She knew that the divine was watching her even if no one else was around, knew that the presence of God was everywhere even if she couldn't see God. Maryam didn't want the privacy of her situation to tempt her into doing something with this beautiful man, something God wouldn't be happy with. Isn't that an excellent lesson to learn, girls? Don't ever forget that God is watching. When you're around boys, God is always watching. If you're alone with a boy, God is watching. If it's just the two of you somewhere, then God is the third. Remember Maryam, girls. Maryam turned to God. She asked the man to go away because she had taqwa. But I know differently. Maryam is a dyke. Isn't it obvious? Doesn't it make sense? She lives alone in a mosque with no one else around, no one to monitor what she does or whom she meets up with, and not a person in the world for company. One day, a handsome and well proportioned man comes to her door unannounced. No one will know if he stays a while, no one will know what they do together. But before he can even talk, Maryam asks him to leave. No, thank you, she says. Please don't talk to me. She would rather have her solitude than the company of this handsome man. Eventually, she lets him stay, but only because he says he's an angel. She hears him out because he's an emissary from God, laughs heartily when he tells her she's going to have a baby. Who, me? She says, no man has ever touched me. No man. And I know she was pious. I know that she was always aware that God was watching, but there's no hesitation, not even for a second, when she turns him down and bars him from her space. It must be because Maryam doesn't like men, not handsome ones, not well proportioned ones. These things don't even register for her. No man has ever touched her, she says. She hasn't let them. She hasn't been interested. Maryam is a dyke. Or maybe she isn't. Who knows? Dyke isn't even part of my vocabulary at 14, and maybe I'm reading too much into the story, these few lines of a text that's been around for 1400 years. But what I do know is this: Maryam is something, somehow like me. I feel different that day after Quran class. Relieved at first, after the embarrassment dies down, after I'm done playing off the question as intentional, after I'm done receiving high fives in the hallways from my classmates for my joke. I'm relieved that no one has caught on, and I'm relieved that I'm not the only one like this. And after this relief comes elation. There are other women like me in the Quran, women who are uninterested in men, who are born wrong, living lives that are entirely out of their control, women who rage to God no less about wanting to die.
Wow, thank you so much for reading that. I just want to say that I remember when this book came out a year ago, Lamya, and I read it in one day. Like I was so enticed by this book and how beautifully written it was. And I just want to say thank you for creating this. And I wanted to ask, yeah, like I said, it's been a year. How are you feeling about the book? Um,
Mm.
Now that it's in paperback, it's all over the world. People are loving it. How are you feeling with everything that's going on?
First of all, props to you for reading it in one book. It went in one day. I'm so impressed that people still do that. I Yeah, it's been a year, which is really, really crazy to me. I've just had a really eventful year, and so yeah, it's been really interesting. Um I didn't know what to expect of this year. And I guess like not just this year, the year before it too, because there's so much that goes into publishing a book, which, as someone who didn't really have a lot of experience in that industry, I didn't really know. I kind of wrote this book, and then sort of like sent it out into the world and went into the rest of the process kind of totally blind. So yeah, I was it's been a really cool and crazy experience, and one that I am so grateful for. Yeah, the book came out about a year and a month ago, I guess. And yeah, I just like didn't know what to expect in terms of the reception. I knew that I wanted to write a book that was unapologetically queer and unapologetically Muslim, and I didn't know how the world or readers would respond. I had kind of forgotten that people actually read a book once you write it. You know, when you're writing, it's you and a laptop, and then you give it to people to read, and like you interact with people who have read it on an individual basis as opposed to sort of like a collective basis. And yeah, so I wrote this book and people read it, and that's kind of been blowing my mind, that it's a thing that's out there in the world, and all my sort of like vulnerabilities are out there in the world. But it's been really lovely. Yeah, the amount of sort of like positive feedback and support has been like really, really incredible and overwhelming. In a really lovely way. I get people writing to me about how the book has resonated with them. People who are, people who share identities with me, and then people who have like absolutely nothing, I guess like in a superficial way, like nothing in common with me. And it's just been really, really, really lovely to see that it resonates with people. I kind of wrote this book for the person that I was when I needed it. When I was sort of like figuring out how to live my life and how to be a person in the world, and just feeling like I had no models for that. And it's been really lovely to see that resonate with folks too, that, that you can carve out a life for yourself uh, based on sort of like exploration and thinking through the things that you've been taught, and being critical and asking questions and being curious about the world.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Like it's so I'm so happy that you're getting such great responses from the book because like I said, it is something I have never read before and I really appreciate you being here and talking about this book. I wanted to ask, you kind of talked a little bit about it, but like when writing this book, what was the process behind it? You know, you said that you sent it out to people to read, you know, before it was released. How long did it take for you to write the book? What was the process? Were you like going to cafes and like finding inspiration outside of your home? Like, what did that look like for you before it being out into the world?
So, I didn't grow up writing a lot. I grew up reading a lot, and I think reading is such good practice for the act of writing. But I started writing in my 20s, and so I don't know. I just feel like there are people who have such disciplined practices around writing, and there are people who are sort of like immersed in writing worlds, whether it's sort of like doing workshops or taking classes or having like a writing group. And I feel like, I don't know, because I didn't sort of like grow up in these worlds, I feel like I fashioned a way to write that really worked for me. I read somewhere recently, someone compared writing to having a crush, and that's exactly what my writing practice feels like. I get really intrigued by an idea, and like, something will just sort of like stick in my head, and I'll try to figure out how to approach it and how to think through this problem and why something is sticking in my head. And to me, writing is a really good way to explore that. And so I get sort of like obsessed with an idea, and I find myself finding all the snatches of time that I can to write, whether it's, um, on the notes app, on the subway, or, at work when you sneak into a stairwell because you have 15 minutes that you're pretending to be in the bathroom or something. And yeah, so a lot of my writing was done in sort of like different snatches in time. But I also did a lot of Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. being at the coffee shop when it just opened. And I'm a person who naturally has a lot of energy, so I don't drink caffeine. So I would get a decaf mocha at 7 a.m. at the coffee shop, and all the baristas would be like, "What the fuck?" But yeah, so that's where a lot of my writing happened. I It took about 4 years to write. I started off as an essayist. I would write a lot of essays, and have them published on the internet back when I guess like personal essays were a big thing. I don't know if you remember the sort of like 2014, 2015, 2016 era when like it just felt like there was a lot of space for people to write these like personal essays that reflected on both their life and the world around them. That's how I started writing. And then as I was writing those essays, this idea, well, so I had written an essay about my experience going to visit my family and taking my partner as a friend on Eid. And I was thinking a lot about Hajar and how her story mirrors that story. And so I wrote this essay about Hajar, which is actually one of the essays that comes right towards the end of the book. And from there, I started writing these essays, and I found that I could thematically link them. And so to go from sort of like an a series of essays to a memoir, just something that had a little bit more sort of like plot and flow from essay to essay and moved in time and space. I had to sort of like learn how to do that. But but yeah, so originally the book was written as a series of essays, and then I really put thought and effort into how I wanted the story to move through the essays. Yeah, and that process took about 4 years. I actually ended up writing a big chunk of it during shutdown. In the early stages of the COVID pandemic. So it's really fun to be doing a Zoom event right now because it's like, oh, nostalgia, except not. Um, but yeah, so it was interesting because a lot of the book was written in these snatches of time, and then shutdown happened, and then suddenly all I had was time because I had the kind of job where I had to be in person for it, so I couldn't do work. And so it was really just like mind blowing to have all that time and space to write. So I ended up writing a big chunk of it during shutdown. And then it traveled out into the world.
Mm, what a process. Wow. I didn't know you were an essayist before like this. So like, is your stuff like online
It
still?
is,
Okay,
yeah.
cool. Okay, wait, I'm gonna read that when I get off the Zoom.
Amazing. What kind of writing do you do?
I do a lot of poetry,
Hmm.
and I'm also trying to write my own book right now, so I'm in the process of doing that, and it is really hard. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's been really fun to like, create these characters and create these
Mhm.
worlds, these characters, and I feel like I'm growing with them as I'm writing it, so it's been
Mhm.
really beautiful. So,
Is it fiction?
it is fiction. Yes, I'm a big fiction girly.
Mhm.
So I was like, I want to write like a contemporary fiction right now. So I'm
Hell
really,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I have so much respect for fiction writers, because I used my life as a starting point for so much of the writing, but people who create entire worlds and entire characters with entire sort of like monologue, like internal lives, I have
oh
so much respect for it. I can't wait to read your book.
my gosh, thank you so much. Don't worry, I'll give you a copy. I'll let you read the transcript if you'd like.
Hell
Um,
yeah.
Speaking of, I wanted to talk about like the inspiration behind kind of like your writing style because it is very beautiful and you do such an amazing job with like, chronologically telling your story. I wanted to ask, did you draw inspiration from other writers? I know that the title Hijab Butch Blues is inspired by Stone Butch Blues, which is Leslie Feinberg. Were you inspired by Leslie Feinberg? Were you inspired by anybody else? Like, yeah, who are some of your inspirations?
Hmm. So Leslie Feinberg is a huge one. As I was coming up with a title for this book, I really wanted to pay homage to my queer writing ancestors, and I feel like Leslie Feinberg really changed the way that I think about writing. I read Stone Butch Blues in my 20s, and it really blew my mind because I love the way that it told the story of this protagonist through sort of like personal day-to-day interactions, but was also this beautiful, important book about that was very, very political. So I was so inspired by this way of sort of like telling smaller stories that that made larger political points. And Stone Butch Blues just the breadth that it covers is incredible. And when I read it, it really like changed how I thought about books and what books could do in the world. So it was really, really important to me to give a nod to that. And i think I think a lot about all the like brilliant queer literature that's coming out in the world, and I think a lot about the people that made it happen, that wrote so that we could write. Another big inspiration for me in terms of writing is Audre Lorde, because that's again, like Audre Lorde's books changed for me what I thought writing could do, and how it could be both political and how it could tell these like really like just these like beautiful little big stories. Yeah, so I read Sister Outsider in my early 20s, and I just like I had to like stop for a couple of days. I had to stop like everything that I was doing so I could not just like read it, but just sort of like inhale that book. Um yeah, so Audre Lorde is a big one. And again, like Audre Lorde's writing is so poetic and lyrical. That it also it was also just a really good reminder that like writing doesn't have to be dry. It can also be playful and play with words and use things like repetition and alliteration and just um and have these lines that are just so that have just like never left me. Yeah, so those are my two big ones.
Oh my gosh, yes. I've been reading a lot of Audre Lorde this year. I
Mm.
like read Zombie for the
Mm.
first time actually like back in January, and it was like, yeah, like you said, very life-changing and just so poetic. And you know, I will never be the same, after reading it. And I like have like her collection of poems that I'm reading right now, and I like read a poem by her every night before I go to bed.
Oh, I love that.
So it's been really beautiful to like just yeah connect with Audre Lorde through her work, and like I don't know, I feel like she's just laying beside me as well, like every night before I go to bed. It's yeah, so
I love that for you.
yeah, she's perfect. But yes, I have one more question before we open it up to the audience questions. I wanted to ask so each chapter of the book, as you said, relates back to figures from the Quran. What was the process like, choosing each figure from the Quran to reference in the book? And yeah, what was that like?
I feel like it was different for every essay. Some of them, or every sort of like chapter in the book, some of the essays just sort of like came to me because I had been talking about these figures and like really sort of like drawing parallels with my life as I lived it. So Mariam, for example, was someone that I definitely knew that I wanted to write about because I had been talking about her for so long, and I had been talking about this like way in which I was, convinced that she was a dyke. And some of the other essays, came about because some of the other figures I chose because like there was something that I was like stuck on. So for example, the story of Hajar that I talked about earlier, where I went to visit my family and took my partner as a friend. I was thinking about Hajar a lot because it was Eid. That's why we had gone to visit. And, you know, the story of Eid is that Ibrahim, also known as Abraham, is asked by God supposedly to slaughter his son as a sacrifice, but it's all that story has always made me really angry because Hajar is, you know, the mother of Ismail, and no one ever really talks about her. Like, what about her sacrifice? What about her sort of like rage? What about her sort of like agency in life? And so I was thinking a lot about that story as I was having this experience where both me and my partner were, you know, engaged in this like huge act of love and sacrifice so that she could meet my family, so that they could meet her. So that essay sort of like came about in that way. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. So actually the story of Yusuf, where I talk a lot about him being sort of like left in a well by his brothers and his sort of like abandonment issues, and this idea, this way in which he, you know, makes himself kind of indispensable so that he doesn't get left as an adult, and sort of like mirroring that with some of my own issues around being loved and feeling loved. And yeah, so that sort of like came about because I was reading the Quran with a friend and we were talking about the story, and I was thinking about I was reflecting about the story in terms of my own life. Yeah, so in most of the stories it sort of just like came to me. And yeah, and you know, it's so funny because sometimes people ask me if there are other prophets in the Quran or figures in the Quran that I wish I had written about. And I kind of wish I had written about all of them because I actually think that so many of them have these stories that are inherently queer, especially if you don't think about straightness as the default. There's something about all of the stories where they all feel like they're all like they beg questions, like why is this story so important that it's in this text, and you know, what are the decisions that these figures are making and why are they making them and what are their internal narratives. And so yeah, I wish I had been able to write about all of them.
Absolutely. Okay, I have one more question actually. Do you, do you go back and read the Quran now? Like, do you read it often, or have you revisited it since, creating this book?
It's a great question. So me and my friend are in the process of reading the Quran from start to finish, with this tafsir, which is this sort of like interpretation of the verses. So it's a translation, and then there's this like collection of what other sort of like scholars have said about it. And it's a really interesting Quran because when it came out, everyone was really, really excited about it because it was so comprehensive. It was drawing from like a whole bunch of sources, including Sunni sources, Shia sources, etc. It's called the Study Quran, if anyone has heard of it. But so me and my friend started reading it, I guess, about, uh, 6 years ago now. Yeah, no, probably more than that, seven. And we started reading it being like, okay, you know, if we do 10 pages a day, a week, we can get through this. We'll be done in like 5 years. We got this. We're both like also like type A overachievers. And then, you know, life happened. And we're only about 2/3 of the way through it, but we've slowly been reading it, and it's been like such an incredible and special experience, and one that I write about in the book too, because this friend is also queer, and um just yeah, it's been really special to read with someone and to be able to read in a way that feels messy. Like we you know, had a lot of sort of like ground rules, and we had a lot of conversation before we started reading about, you know, just bringing sort of like our full selves and allowing each other to really like question things and be and like feel our feelings, like be angry, be upset, be moved. And so it's been really lovely to read that, both in terms of sort of being able to talk about it, but also in the way that it's made our friendship grow. That's been really cool. Um, because so much has happened to both of us in the past 8 years of our lives. And yeah, so it's been really cool to see both our interpretation and our readings evolve as we evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. I am done with my portion of my questions. Megan, if you want to, I'm gonna bring it back to you.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Lamya. Yeah, we'll take questions from the audience now. You can write them in the chat, and then Michaela or I will read them aloud so Lamya can answer. And it looks like we already have one. So one of my favorite sections in your book is Allah, SWT. It reminded me of when I first read Islamic feminist texts and different tafsir that led me to learn how nafs is not gendered. That was such a moment for me, and it was so affirming to read that someone else had a similar experience. Since you published your book, what are some comments from fellow Muslims that have stayed with you, if you're able to share? That's their question.
That's such a good question. And also, I love that question because I also remember the moment where I read, in this like very like classical tafsir about how nafs is not gendered, and this moment in which Adam is said to have a nafs that is referred to using she, I guess like she pronouns. Um, and it, yeah, I just like remember reading that and being like, oh my God, here is this very like classical interpretation of this text. And like, how come no one talks about this? So yeah, I'm so glad to know that you had a similar experience. And yeah, what are some comments that have stayed with me? Uh, Yeah, it's been really lovely to see. It seems like the Allah chapter really resonates with a lot of folks. It also doesn't resonate with a lot of folks. I was not expecting the amount of pushback that I got about that chapter compared to some of the other chapters. So in that chapter, I talk about Allah as being trans slash non-binary, and in this way of sort of like transcending gender. And a lot of people were really, really upset at that, which you can tell if you go to the Goodreads page for my book. But yeah, so that's been really interesting. I think this is not specifically a Muslim comment, but someone recently told me that they talked to their therapist about my book, which like totally made my life. I feel like that made me feel like I had made it, that this person was talking to their therapist about my book. Um, yeah, and another sort of like totally random moment that has stayed with me is a friend recommended me my book because she didn't realize that I was a person who had written it because I wrote it under a pseudonym. And that also totally made my life like just, yeah.
Amazing. The next question is from Mon. And it says, "Hi Lamia, thanks a lot for making the book. I have read your book and somewhat feel found, kind of like reading my own diary. I'm a queer Muslim and living in the largest Muslim population country. Your story calms me knowing that I'm not alone who feels this way. You're so good at telling a story about the Quran. What Sira book do you read? Any recommendations? And if I may ask, are there any open online based queer Muslim community slash group that I can join?"
Oh my God, I love this question because I get to talk about some of my favorite queer Muslim orgs. Unfortunately, a lot of them are based in the US, but I know at least some of them have put a lot of effort into having gatherings that people from other countries can join, just like so like having the events in at a time where other people can join as well. One of my favorite community groups is called Masjid, the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. They used to have a queer Muslim retreat, which is not happening these days because of COVID and the ongoing pandemic. But it was just like a really incredible space, and they have since shifted to a lot of virtual programming. They have this really incredible Ramadan like events calendar right now. I don't know if it's up on their website, but they definitely, it went out in their newsletter. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's on their Instagram. But they have, one of the gatherings is sort of like a global international Muslim queer Muslim gathering, and I think it's early on in the day in the US, so that it'll be sort of later at night for folks in other time zones. So that's definitely one of my absolute favorites. Other orgs that are doing really incredible work are Queer Crescent, which is based on the West Coast. There is a newer group called Hidayah, which is doing work in the UK and is also trying to do work in the US. Then there are a lot of sort of local groups, which are really incredible. Yeah, I feel so grateful to a lot of these spaces because I feel like meeting other queer Muslims really changed how I think about my queerness and my Muslimness, and it showed me that it was possible to be a person in the world. And yeah, so I'm just like really, really grateful for a lot of these spaces. And I'm really grateful for a lot of them starting to do a lot more virtual programming because like, you know, if you live in sort of like urban metropolitan areas, it's easier to find community, but sometimes it can be hard and isolating when people don't live in these hubs. So it's really cool to see that. I don't have any good Sira book recommendations. Yeah, but yeah, I find that I read a lot of I read a lot of different interpretations of the Quran. That's kind of what I've been really into recently, and just sort of like comparing and contrasting between them, and really thinking through their word choices, why they choose to translate a word a certain way and not.
Okay, the next question is from Tori, and they said, I understand why you've decided to stay anonymous, and I'm curious if you have considered revealing your identity, and if so, what factors might lead you to do so?
Also another really good question. So it's actually something that I write about in my book. Towards the end, there's this chapter called Eunice, which is about the story of Jonah and the whale. And growing up, I always thought of the whale as punishment, like it was a punishment for Eunice because he, you know, didn't stick it out with his people. He like gave up, he left, he, you know, got on this boat, and he was like, I can't do this anymore, I'm out. But what this process of writing under a pseudonym has taught me, and sort of like through conversations with my friends, I've come to really see this idea of a whale as protection. And to me, writing under a pseudonym feels that way. It feels like a protection. And, you know, Eunice eventually makes his way out of the whale, but I don't know if I will or will not. But what I do know is this, that to me, it felt really important to write this book that was exploring, you know, topics that I knew would be really controversial, not just to Muslims, but also to people of other Abrahamic faiths. I also definitely had this moment where I was like, oh my God, I talk so much about the racism and misogyny and transphobia in the queer community. Am I not going to be invited to any more queer potlucks? So I definitely went into this being like, I want to feel like I'm in a whale. I want to be, I want that layer of protection. I want to not be Googleable. And I want my address to not be Googleable. Yeah. And so it was really important to me to write under a pseudonym. And I've never regretted that decision. It still feels like such a good life decision. But I've really had to learn how to hold my boundaries. And some of them are really like simple. Like I don't like doing virtual events where I can't have my camera off. So and just sort of like really like sort of like respecting myself enough to uphold that boundary has been it's actually been a really cool process of just like like reminding myself that this is how boundaries work and this is important to me. um what might what might consider me to reveal my identity? I just don't feel like I owe it to anyone to reveal my identity. I just don't think that it like I feel like I revealed so much in my memoir. I just don't think it adds anything to, I guess, like, I don't know, like have a face or yeah, or have a name that is not one that I chose for myself. So yeah, I don't see myself, I guess, like revealing my identity, but to me, I feel like I've revealed so much about myself that it actually says way more than my face or real name would.
Thank you. The next question is from Lale, and they said, I love the book and I'm so grateful you wrote it. One of the most moving sections for me was when you were discussing alienation, belonging, and likened being in the US to an abusive, or likened being in the US to a abusive relationship. Can you talk a little more about how you struggled with belonging in the US, especially the colonized colonizer dichotomy?
Okay, this is such a good question because I've been thinking about it so much. I actually last week just got approved for citizenship, which took 21 years. I came here, 21 years ago, and through a series of sort of like visas and like, various things, I have finally been able to get citizenship. And so I mean, like it hasn't happened yet. I haven't, done the whole oath ceremony, so I still have a few more days of in betweenness and struggling. Well, I mean, I hope I still continue to struggle even after having citizenship with this idea of like, what does it mean um to be someone who is off this country? Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I am so angry. I'm so angry at the way that the US is positioning itself in with respect specifically right now to the genocide that's happening in Palestine, and other places, Sudan, the Congo, etc. Just and yeah, like what does it mean to be a part of this country? And like, the other thing is I've also just like had to fight to become a citizen. I've had to fight to be able to live here after, spending most of my life here. And what does it mean to go from that to having, I guess, like some semblance of stability? Yeah, yeah. But then, I also think a lot about like fuck borders and fuck the way that this country makes you feel like you don't belong if you don't have a certain document. Yeah, so yeah, it's just something that I've been grappling with a lot, especially as someone who comes from a country that was colonized and then grew up in a country that was essentially built by the US but built specifically by like companies from the US for its purposes. Yeah. Yeah, okay, that was a really long, rambly rant. All this to say that I have lots of complicated feelings that I'm still figuring out, and who knows, maybe it'll be another book.
Okay, the next question is from Asif. And he says, "Thank you for giving us a gift, Lamya. As you were writing your memoir, did you uncover additional information or stories about your family that you want to research and uncover further?"
I didn't. For the longest time, I've wanted to talk to my parents and my, I guess like now one surviving grandparent, and aunts and uncles about sort of like their experiences, growing up, living through very specific wars. But I really struggle with how to ask those questions, and how like and just the ethics of not re-traumatizing them, but also being like these are my stories too, and I need to know them. So yeah, I really struggle with like figuring out that navigating sort of like that experience, and I haven't quite figured it out yet. So if anyone has answers, or if anyone has done it successfully, please tell me how. But what was really interesting is that as I was writing and reading, I feel like I learned so much more about the prophets and all these figures in the Quran. Like I feel like I had, pretty extensive background in them, having gone to an Islamic school, and having sort of like studied their stories over and over in like Islam class and in Quran class, and Islamic history class. But I feel like I learned about all of these other dimensions to them that yeah, that just like really like grew my empathy for them as people.
Um, we have like about 10 minutes, so I'm just gonna like randomly choose some questions. Um, and this one is from Mandy. Um, they asked, as a queer person who was raised as a Christian but is now no longer religious in any way, do you have moments where your faith feels like it's clashing with your queerness? How do you handle when it comes up?
Um, you know, that's that's a really good question, and one that like one that I don't quite know how to answer, and one that I just like have never really known how to answer, because there's this way in which people are always asking how I reconcile queerness and religion, and it's never felt like that to me. It's never felt like those two are sort of like at war with each other, or are in need of reconciliation, um or are even, yeah, so or that the project of reconciliation is an important one. I don't necessarily think that it is like, I like, just what does reconciliation even mean, like, and what does it like do, but in terms of sort of like, but then when people who have faith ask me this question, I feel a lot of like, like love and empathy, because I'm like, oh, we're all struggling with this together. Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways in a lot of ways the two sort of like rub up against each other, but to me it doesn't feel like it's the essence of those that are clashing. It feels to me it's the way that people are interacting with them that's clashing. So yeah, I mean, like, I guess like an example would be if I like would be when I go to mosque, and sometimes I feel uncomfortable wearing, like, I interpret hijab in a lot of like ways that in a lot of sort of like playful ways. So for me, like wearing a snapback that covers my hair is also hijab, or wearing a beanie is also hijab, or sometimes a bike helmet is also hijab. But I wouldn't necessarily wear those kinds of hijab to my mosque, and I guess like that is a way that they kind of like rub up against each other and have friction. And it leads to a very sort of like intentional way that I practice my faith in very particular spaces. So yeah, like how do I deal with that? I don't know. I compartmentalize. I find other spaces where I can sort of like express myself to my fullest in terms of both things. And I surround myself with other people who see me and see me in my queerness and see me in my Muslimness and see me in trying to live in ways that honor both of them.
Thank you. And I would point out also that Lale shared in the chat a link to a related essay by Lamya. So you can find that there if you're interested. Thank you, Lale. Okay, we might have time for 2 more questions, maybe. So the next one I'll read is from Eskadar. Thank you so much for sharing with us. You touched on this a bit, but can you talk a little more about how your views on the role, power of writing has changed and connections between your writing and your organizing work?
Um, Also another really good question. Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like the people that I read in my 20s, specifically queer writers, specifically Black writers, specifically writers who were really thinking through the ways that writing influences politics and is a tool for organizing. Yeah, I feel like I read all these writers in my 20s and it just changed for me what I thought that writing could do. I find myself going back to Teju Cole's tweet a lot. He has this like incredible tweet, which I'm totally gonna butcher by like saying because uh tweets feel weird to say, but I'm just going to say it anyway. He has this tweet that goes, writing as writing, RIGHTING, writing as writing, RIOTING, and on best days, all three. And I think about that a lot. And yeah, so it's always felt really important to me that my writing is connected to sort of like larger struggles and resistance. And I don't think that writing is the only way, obviously, to do this. And I do a lot of organizing work too, but interestingly, I keep those very separate because I do that organizing work under my real name, and a lot of it, but not all of it, is in person. Yeah, so even though those two are happening under sort of like different personas, to me, they feel really interconnected, and they inform each other. For a really long time, I went through a phase where I was reading a lot of sort of like academic theory, and really finding myself in a lot of theory. To me, it like gave me a framework for how to think about things. Like, I read Judith Butler, and it really made me think a lot about gender and performativity and the way that gender is created and maintained. And then interestingly, I started like organizing and like going to meetings and protests and things, and it made me realize the ways that there is so much happening. There's so much sort of like rich conversation and so much rich reimagining and so much rich resistance happening at that level that just gets sort of like captured in a certain way in academia and then becomes, you know, and then just becomes sort of like recorded, but like a lot of the really brilliant work is happening on the level of organizing. Yeah, so that also changed how I think about sort of like sources of knowledge and sort of communities and community building and what kind of work happens in communities. So yeah, long rambly answer, because I tend to get rambly the longer that I talk. But yeah, to me, those are very, very intertwined.
Amazing. We have like 2 minutes. Do you want to answer another question? Do you want, how are you feeling?
Sure, I'd love to take one more question.
Okay, tight. Okay, this is hard. Okay, I'm going to say from A. This is from A. Says first, I love your book. Also, wonder if you care to reflect on the editorial process, feedback you've received from readers on your essays and on your book manuscripts. Have you had many LGBTQ Muslim readers slash editorial feedback? Or were most not Muslim, not LGBTQ plus. And there's like another portion. It's like, did you run into obstacles in the process due to intersectional Muslim LGBTQ plus nature of your memoir? And shout out MASGD.
Yeah, shout out for Masjid. Um, Yeah, thank you for this question. In terms of editorial process, I feel like I was really lucky and found an agent and an editor who both really got my work and really understood what I meant when I wanted the book to be unapologetically queer and unapologetically Muslim, and like really championed like things that were important to me, like staying anonymous or even just like not translating certain phrases or concepts, and just yeah, and just like letting the sort of like letting both the queerness and the Muslimness stand up by themselves, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I just like, I feel like I got really lucky there. And if anyone else is going through that process, I strongly recommend trusting your gut and uh and 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 just really being able to like just really feeling out the people that will be involved in your book. In terms of queer Muslim readers, I, gave it to a whole bunch of my friends to read, which was super helpful. A lot of people had really good feedback. I was in a writing group that, like, was the most affirming uh most affirming thing I've ever done, because my friends basically like taught me like all of these like particular writing skills that I really needed to finish writing the book. Um but yeah, so I had my writing group, which was a lot of queer folks, and then a few of us did like a bunch of queer writing groups, and I had a couple of friends read it. So I was able to get feedback in that way. There was a time when a couple of us queer Muslim writers got together and did a group, and that was really nice, because we all sent out like, I think like 10 to 15 pages and had everyone else read it. And there were some essays that I really struggled with as I was writing the book, so it was really helpful to have other sets of eyes on it. Yeah, and in terms of obstacles in the process, yeah, I mean, like literally every time something fucked up or problematic would happen, my agent would stand up for me in ways that felt so badass. So yeah, I really highly recommend finding an agent who is able to do that. So for example, some of the covers that were drawn up for the book, I actually found kind of racist. And so my agent was really great at sort of just like shutting that down and being like, no, this doesn't work because of XYZ reason. And they're just like leaving no room for negotiation around that.
Okay, so I think sadly we're out of time. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for leaving all these great questions in the chat. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to them all. Lamya, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And thank you, Michaela, for helping organize this event, putting us in touch with Lamya. This was awesome. It was really great to hear you talk, Lamya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So happy to talk to you. You are amazing. And I'm really happy we finally got to chat with each other. You're amazing.
Bye.